Hmm. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this spectacular evening with you, Rick Doblin, founder of MAPS and a true pioneer within this field.
Thank you.
The evening is hosted by the Psychedelic Society of Sweden, and my name is Filippa. I'm the founder and president, and with me is Linda, vice president. We are so honored to have you with us tonight. We admire your work, your dedication, and your courage to keep on moving. And before we move into the uh, the interview, we have people all around Europe joining us tonight online, and we also have a watch party here in Stockholm.
Oh, wonderful. All right.
And we are all looking forward to taking part of this insightful conversation. Some practical info. We have this interview, 75 minutes, and then a Q&A. And at first, people here from Stockholm with us will be able to ask you a question. And after that, you online have the possibility to ask a question as well if time allows. We have John here moderating the chat together
Hello.
with Albin joining online. So if you have a question, please type them in the chat throughout the conversation, and John and Albin will do their best to gather all the questions. Okay. So instead of me summarizing decades of your work and experience, I leave that over for you. But let's start with a question for those who might not know the whole backstory. For example, our parents joining the call tonight. Can you
Oh,
give
great.
us?
So have they been worried about you? I guess that's my question.
They're cheering us. Can you give us a little intro about yourself and your work leading up to MAPS and what is MAPS?
Okay. Um, so the work leading up to MAPS, basically, in 1972, to go way back, when I was 18 years old, is when I read this incredible book by Dr. Stanislav Grof. And this was Realms of the Human Unconscious Observations from LSD Research. And that was his first book that he published. And I read that. And once I read it, I realized that this was what I wanted to dedicate my life to, that I wanted to really focus on bringing back psychedelics. Um, when I read Stan's book in 1972, it was after the backlash against the psychedelic 60s, and the research was shut down. And what I liked about it was that it was science primarily looking at various states of mind, including biographical things that happened during our life, birth trauma, and then also more spiritual, transpersonal, Jungian kind of experiences, and including these ideas of this sort of mystical sense of unitive mystical sense, if I were all in it together, which we're understanding now is more what we see with quantum physics, that there's a level at which both science and sort of these spiritual experiences are in harmony. And I felt that that had a lot of political implications. The more that we feel connected to everything, the harder it will be to dehumanize others, to be against refugees and migrants, to be against people that are different religion or different culture, to trash the environment because we're one and the same as with the environment. So I saw it as having psychedelics having incredible political implications, which was part of the reason why they were shut down. But then the other part of it was that there was this reality check to the whole thing, which was great, which was therapy. Can we use all these theories of mind and all these experiences to actually help people get over depression, trauma, alcoholism, substance abuse? So that was the reality check. It just wasn't idle theory or theorizing. It wasn't neuroscience for, with no practical applications. It was all about therapy. So then I realized that I myself was incapable, I was not mature enough to really move this agenda forward. So I dropped out of college as a freshman when I was 18 years old. I didn't go back for 10 years. I spent 10 years trying to get balanced. And in the slideshow, I've got a few little slides to speak to that. But I'll speak to that now, actually, which is this idea that E.O. Wilson at Harvard He's an incredible man. And what he said was the real problem with humanity is that we have Paleolithic emotions with medieval institutions with godlike technologies. So we are way overdeveloped in our minds as humans, individuals, and as a species. We have incredible, miraculous technologies that permit us to do this webinar today, but we don't have the emotional and spiritual maturity to deal with it. And hence, we're trashing the planet. We could blow ourselves up any minute. We just are going through a period of massive mental illness in the United States, I would say, with denial, repression, lies, that our minds are not working well, and they're overwhelmed by our emotions. And I felt that I needed to refine my emotions and my spiritual connection, and that took 10 years. And then finally, in 1982, I decided to go back to college. I mostly was in the construction business, building things in the physical world, so that my ideas, I would try to put them out in the world, and then you see the flaws in your ideas, and trying to actualize something is a good way to get grounded. So that worked for me. So then 10 years, I go back to school in 1982, and I go to Esalen Institute in Big Sur and study with Stan Groff, and did this month-long workshop with Stan and Christina Groff called The Mystical Quest. And while I was doing that, this woman, Debbie Harlow, came by and said, "Hey, there's a new drug called ADAM, ADAM." And and she's like, "But it's different than the classic psychedelics. It opens your heart, it helps you feel better, helps you feel love, helps you feel connection." And I was like, well, that sounds interesting. And then I saw a group of people there at Esalen doing MDMA, sitting in a circle and talking to each other. And I thought, how boring. When you take a bunch of LSD, you can't talk. You have one of the classic definitions of a mystical experience is that it's ineffable, that you can't put it into words. So I like to say that I was stupid enough to underestimate MDMA, but smart enough to buy some. So I ended up taking it home and did it with my girlfriend. And I was absolutely shocked how profound it was, how deep and more open we were able to communicate, and even delicate subjects we were able to talk about without defensiveness, without um, being egotistical about things. It was just remarkable. But what I also felt was that it was really liberating us to speak about our feelings in ways that we hadn't been able to speak before, but it wasn't creating the feelings, it was revealing the feelings, that it was the love was real. It didn't come from the pill, but that pill helped us to experience it and express it. And what I also realized is that MDMA had just started to become ecstasy and used as a party drug. So it was going to be squashed. This was during Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan and Just Say No and the escalation of the drug war. So I realized that I had learned about LSD after the backlash, and my sort of fighting spirit made me want to pick up LSD in part because of the backlash. But now I learned about MDMA before the backlash, which meant that I could get politically involved. And not only that, because it was legal, that we could introduce it to all sorts of people who would not otherwise take an illegal drug, but would be willing to take a legal drug, and then could be witnesses in our lawsuit that we knew would come once the Drug Enforcement Administration came to criminalize MDMA. So I had incredible meetings with the Assistant Secretary General of the UN, Robert Mueller, who was a French resistance fighter against the Nazis during World War II. He has this other book called What War Taught Me About Peace. But the book that he wrote was called New Genesis, Shaping a Global Spirituality. And it was about this idea that the United Nations is designed to try to help mediate conflicts between countries, but that a lot of the conflicts are actually religious based. And we need to move away from religious fundamentalism and people saying my way is the only way, and I'm willing to kill you if you think differently. We need to move into this understanding that we're all in it together, this global spirituality. It doesn't mean like that we all speak, are all part of the same religion, in the same way that we don't all speak the same language. there's multiple different languages, multiple different religions. I think it's best to think about religions as another language. Different religions have different ways to speak about things, but they're all about coming from the same place, about meaning, purpose, the value of life, this unitive sense of connection. We spoke to rabbis and monks and others, particularly Brother David Steindl-Rast, who was a Roman Catholic monk, who compared MDMA. He used it half dose in the monastery for meditation, and said a monk spends his whole life trying to get to the enlightened attitude you can get with taking MDMA. We gave it to a rabbi who compared MDMA to the Sabbath. So in 1984, I started another organization before MAPS and ended up organizing the entire sort of psychedelic underground, and even those people that were above ground, not that many, to prepare to fight to keep MDMA legal as a medicine. And we launched Drug Enforcement Administration administrative law judge lawsuit, which we won. And the judge said MDMA should be illegal for parties, but it should be legal as a medicine. And the DEA administrator said, forget it, I'm not listening. I'm going to criminalize it for everything. And we won a couple times in the appeals court. So in 1986, I went back and started MAPS as a way to go through the FDA. That was the only way I saw to go through the FDA. Graduate college in 87. I want to get a clinical psych PhD to learn psychotherapy outcome research. How do you prove that psychedelics really help psychotherapy? But at the time, psychedelic research had been blocked for decades. There was no way to legally do psychedelic research, so nobody would let me into graduate school. And so I was really confused. And 1972 to 1987, my whole life had been, let me learn to become a psychedelic therapist, bring back psychedelics, let me get this clinical psych PhD, and that was blocked. So I didn't know what to do. So often when I don't know what to do, I decide to smoke marijuana. So I smoked marijuana, and I'm thinking in a different creative way. And I get this idea that I want too much too soon. I want to do the science, but the politics is stopping me from doing it. So I thought, okay, I need to study the politics of the drug war. And I had not studied anything in college. I had got my major was psychology, focused on transpersonal psychology and psychedelic research. I had got one class credit for suing the DEA to try to keep MDMA legal, but I didn't know anything about the politics, hadn't really studied it. And there was this guy that was a drug policy expert who was in a journal, a magazine, was interviewed, and he mentioned our lawsuit against the DEA. He didn't mention me by name, but he mentioned this lawsuit. And he was at this school I'd never heard of called the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. And I decided to contact him and said, would you be my mentor? And he agreed if I could get in. So in any case, from 88 to 91, I got my master's at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard in public policy. I got into the PhD program, immediately took 10 years off, or almost 10 years off, 7.5 to 8 years off, to build up psychedelic research through MAPS. Then I got my PhD in 2001. Since then, we've been running research with MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD. Most recently, having a setback from the FDA in August, which I can talk about. So sort of that's kind of a long answer, but I think what really motivated me here is fear and despair about humanity as individuals and collectively, and how we are destroying things right and left. And as our technology and as our weapons grow in power, it's even more important that we become more in balance. And that's what I've been focused on basically ever since.
Wow, it sounds like in the beginning it was more room for your parents to be worried.
Well, they were actually, because I'm the oldest of four kids, and so I was the first one to go to college. And so in my very first year of college, and maybe this could be a lesson to your parents, I'll just say. So my first year in college, I'm doing all this LSD. It's becoming more important to me than my school studies. I actually had a class by a woman who studied with Carl Jung. It was pretty
Mm.
amazing, and it was a class in Jungian psychology. But I couldn't um, process it intellectually. I knew that my LSD trips were really difficult, and I knew I needed to get in balance. So I called my parents and I said, I want to drop out of college. I want to study LSD, and I want you all to pay for it. And after a couple of months, they agreed, which
Wow. Wow.
was pretty
Yeah.
amazing. Yeah, they said that they thought I was making a mistake. Now, I don't know if your parents think you're as stubborn as I am, but my parents said, we think you're a stubborn guy, and if we don't help you, um, it's going to take you longer to realize it's a mistake. And once you realize it's a mistake, you're not going to want to admit that your parents were right. So that'll take you even longer to change your direction. But if we help you, then you'll realize it's a mistake sooner. And but then they also said that they had a tiny, tiny fraction of a chance maybe I actually knew what I needed to do. And so
Mm.
anyway, I was just blessed with super supportive parents, even though I broke their heart and shattered their dreams for me. It didn't take till I got my PhD from Harvard that they finally relaxed.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, thank you. So let's dive into the FDA situation.
Oh,
Do you want to
okay.
give us a little bit of the background and actually what happened?
Yeah. I wonder if I should briefly just show these slides, kind of
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
orienting. Okay, so let me do that. And then let me view slideshow. Let me tell you. Okay, can you see this now?
Yeah.
Okay,
Perfect.
all right. So I founded MAPS in 86, 2001, got my PhD. In 2014, 28 years after I started MAPS, we started a for-profit company, but not traditional for-profit, more public benefit corporation, which means public benefit is over profit. It's a variation on capitalism. There's thousands of these schools, these companies now. I started that in 2014, and I'm speaking to you as a president of MAPS, not as a representative of the pharmaceutical company Lykos. This is the logo of MAPS. On the right, you can see how it is. On the left is by Alex Gray, the psychedelic artist. And the reason it's our logo and the reason that I want to explain what it is that the hands, people helping each other, are in front of the psychedelic imagery in the back. What that means is that it's about therapy more than about the drug. The drugs can be helpful, they can be harmful. The drugs are just tools. They're like a hammer. You can hit somebody over the head or you can build a house with it. That psychedelics are tools, and how they're used is what really determines whether they're beneficial or harmful. So what this means is that when we talk about psychedelic assisted therapy, the emphasis is on the therapy, not on the psychedelic. And that's what our logo communicates, that it's really about people helping people. MAPS, as the nonprofit, is working to advance research, to change policy, and to shape culture. We have a very broad mission, and we're also focusing globally, not just in the US, which is why I'm so delighted to be speaking to you in Sweden and with people around Europe and elsewhere. So these are sort of MAPS's missions. It's 38 years. We were really lucky in that the universe decided to celebrate our 38th anniversary. It was on April 8th, 2024, and there was a full solar eclipse through the United States. So this from the solar eclipse taken during the MAPS's 38th anniversary. Now, MAPS has received over $150 million in donations since 1986, and loads of people have volunteered their time and worked for below market. So we have all sorts of work, and now MAPS primarily works towards globalization of access to MDMA through global humanitarian projects, one in Denmark that we're working on with Syrian refugees with a group called Oasis, one in Bosnia with survivors of the Srebrenica massacre. But we work towards globalization and we work towards legalization. So I know drug policy reform is not so advanced in Sweden, but over time, hopefully it will be. So while we focus on medicine and medicalizing MDMA and other psychedelics, that's only part of the mission. The mission is to make it so that people can have access to this in legal contexts whether they have a diagnosis or whether they want just personal growth or they want a spiritual experience. So that's MAPS. Lykos, the pharmaceutical company, raised around $100 million. I failed to raise all the money from philanthropy. That's what I really wanted to do. But we catalyzed this whole psychedelic renaissance. And then a couple of years ago, there's hundreds now of new psychedelic pharmaceutical companies. And it became more difficult for us to raise donations because people are like, hey, look at all these people making money. Why don't I just invest? So we ended up taking money from investors, but at the current moment, we're the largest single shareholder. We appoint the majority of the board. But what I've seen, and this has been really sad for me, is that once we took on investors, it was no longer what's best for patients. It became more and more a traditional pharmaceutical company. And I've been really upset about that. And so I've been trying to find, and we'll get to your question about what happened with the FDA, because I think it happened because of this conservative nature of the people at Lykos Therapeutics that didn't really understand what they were doing. It wasn't just science, it had to be about culture as well and about public communication. So I've tried to find new investors to take over Lykos, and I've managed to do it. Now, this is Antonio Gracias. Back in 2000, he donated $1 million to MAPS for our phase 3 research. He's also donated $16 million to Harvard for creating what he called pan-psychedelic, pan-Harvard, pan-departments across the department. So it's the divinity school, the law school, the medical school, and other schools at Harvard collaborate on psychedelic events, psychedelic-related policies, things like that. So he's a noted philanthropist in the area of psychedelics. He's donated money to the Bronx VA for research with veterans. And I approached him and asked him if he would be the white knight to come along and try to take over Lykos and turn it back more towards public benefit. And so there was this Financial Times article that was January 9th. We're still in the process of it, but it's looking really, really well. Like MAPS will return to more focus on public benefit and more on global humanitarian projects as well. What is the therapy that we are doing? We call it inner-directed therapy. Now, the most important thing in psychotherapy outcome research that I've learned, even though I was not able to get a PhD in that, was that the most important factor when you predict therapeutic outcomes is what's called the therapeutic alliance. It's the trust between the patient and the therapist. It's their alliance on getting better. And that's more important than the school of therapy. Is it cognitive behavioral therapy? Is it prolonged exposure? Is it Freudian analysis? Is it Jungian analysis? Is it any different kind of therapies? The most important factor is this trusting alliance between the therapist and the participants. And that's what we focus on, is this extra effort on preparation and integration. But preparation is to build trust in the process, educate people about what MDMA does, how the therapy works, the range of experiences you can have. But the key part of this is this direction of the session sourced from the participant's experience. So we all know that when we go to sleep, below our level of conscious awareness, we are dreaming. Things come to us in our dreams. I remember the dream I had last night, which I spent a bunch of time thinking about after I woke up this morning. So there's a way in which things emerge from the unconscious, emerge from our mind into our dreams, into psychedelic sessions. And so what we believe is that there's this inner-directed therapeutic approach that we each have this natural ability to heal. Now, we all know that's true with our bodies. You get a cut, your body restores the shape it had before without us knowing how to do it. There is this inner healing intelligence that's woven into every cell of our body. We know that for our body. But is there something similar for our mind? That is the theory, that there's this inner healing intelligence And all that that means, you don't have to believe in it. It's not that it needs to be, quote, scientifically validated. It just means that we trust the process. We trust that what's emerging into the awareness of the patient is what we support. Things can emerge in physical pains or sensations that are not pains, or distant memories, or just emotions without connected to a story, or fears, or any kind of things that we support what's emerging. And we know that in over 400 people that have been studied with PTSD, that people will eventually, in their own way, get directly to talk about the traumas that they experienced. That they will naturally go there, but their route to get there is different from every individual. So this is kind of the therapeutic approach. We have a 6-day in-person training program where about 50 people go to a resort or a hotel or something, live together, talk about it in the meals, talk about it in the evenings, watch videotapes of therapy sessions, doing role play, things like that. And then the next step is we recommend, but we do not require. It's never going to be required, always optional, that therapists have their own experience with MDMA so that they understand what it does and they understand what their patients are going through. In this therapeutic setting, it's an 8-hour MDMA session, and around half the time, people's eyes are closed, they're listening to music, they're having an internal experience. The other half of the time, more or less, they're talking to the therapists. So there's a lot more dialogue and discussion with MDMA than there is with LSD or psilocybin. But just think about this. Around half the time, the patient is just sitting there, eyes closed, having this incredible experience, not talking to the therapist. The therapists are sitting there sort of meditatively focused on body language. Every once in a while, they'll check in to see how people are doing. But if they've done MDMA, they have a much better idea of what's going on. They don't need to constantly interfere. So this is the treatment approach. This is the design for the therapy. And this will, there's just a few more slides, and this will get back to your question about what happened at the FDA. So what this shows is that we're designing this because psychedelics have been so stigmatized and demonized, everything's criminalized. What we had to do was get the best results. So this is a study designed to get the best results from the hardest to treat patients, which is patients who have PTSD on a chronic basis. We enroll people who've previously attempted suicide. We have over 90% of the people have suicidal ideation, 40% serious suicidal ideation, over 30% have actually called positive behavior, where they've tried to kill themselves or they have bought a rope and didn't use it, or gone to a bridge and thought about jumping off but didn't do it. So we have the worst cases. They've often failed with pharmacotherapy, with psychotherapy, and we have 3 MDMA sessions. This is 1 month apart. And this is 42 hours of therapy, 3 MDMA sessions, therapy plus MDMA, each 8 hours long. And we have 12 90-minute non-drug psychotherapy sessions, 3 for preparation, 1 week apart at the beginning, and then 3 of these 90-minute sessions for integration after each MDMA session. Everybody is enrolled, and they're either randomized to therapy with MDMA or therapy with inactive placebo. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why we use inactive placebo instead of low-dose MDMA or tranquilizers or niacin or other things that are used in psilocybin research that don't work as a placebo. But this is the basic idea. We compare therapy with MDMA, the first session, 80 milligrams, followed 1.5 to 2.5 hours later by 40. The second and third are discussions with the therapist and patients, whether they go up to 120 or stay at the 80. Over 90% go up to 120, and over 90% stay at the 120 for the third one. So this is the intervention, and we evaluate 2 months after the last experimental session to show that things are durable. It's not just like you're the MDMA afterglow or anything like that. This is our phase 3 design, but you could already tell, because we used an inactive placebo, that people can tell the difference between whether they got nothing or whether they got MDMA. That should not be surprising. Although some people are confused. It's not like completely, but most people are pretty clear what they got. All right, so now after the FDA rejection, there was just a meeting January 15th that Lykos had with the FDA, and this idea of independent third-party review. So at FDA, wants to see is whether they can trust our data. And there were so many allegations that were made. The data is unreliable. We're zealots. We're telling people not to report their adverse events, or we're telling them to exaggerate the benefits. Not true, but these are the accusations. So what's next is going to be a 5 to 6 month review of around 9 or 10,000 hours of videotapes to try to verify by independent third party to show there's no abuse taking place, that there's no coercion, there's no telling people change the what they say. And then also, one of the big critiques of the advisory committee and the FDA in their rejection was that Lykos didn't gather what they call positive adverse events. What is an adverse event? It's something you don't like. What's a positive adverse event? Well, it's you like the drug. Oh, I love this drug. This feels great. I feel like I'm really peaceful. I've never been this peaceful. All of those things are now, according to the FDA, potentially danger signs to lead to people wanting to do MDMA after the study is over. So that's why they're called positive adverse events. And the company did not gather that information, even though FDA wanted them to do that, and that was a big mistake. So watching the videotapes will also gather information about positive adverse events. And then hopefully in June or so, or July, the results will be submitted to the FDA, and there will be a discussion about whether to approve MDMA without another phase 3 study, or whether another phase 3 study is needed. If another phase 3 study is needed, approval is probably delayed till 2028. But potentially we could have approval in 6 months or so. So these are the different ways. On the left-hand side is this independent third-party review, demonstrates reliability of data, completes the safety database, no additional phase 3 studies required, FDA approves prescription use, and what they would probably do is what's called a phase 4 study, where these are requirements after it's a prescription medicine, but FDA wants more information about safety. So that's one option. Or the other is that either the independent third-party review does show that it's reliable, but they still want another phase 3 study, or they don't like the third-party review. Then we're going to be required to do another phase 3 study, one arm combining it with prolonged exposure, cognitive processing, something like that, and no sooner approval than January 2028. And then this just let everybody know that June 16th to 20th, we're going to have a Psychedelic Science Conference in Denver. In June 2023, we had 12,400 people. These pictures are from June 2023. And so we've already had 1,500 proposals for talks at this conference. Absolutely amazing. So, okay, so
Wow.
that's the overview. Now,
Thank you.
Yeah, so let me now get directly to your question about what happened at the FDA.
Yeah.
So one of the terrible mistakes that the Lykos pharmaceutical company made was to think that you could do traditional methods for something that was novel and had never done before. And so one of the ideas that this pharma company had, which I objected to but wasn't able to change, although now with the new owners coming in, I think things will be different. But they decided, that the pharma company decided on what they called a quiet period. And what that means is that a year, year and a half before a drug is reviewed by the FDA, the pharmaceutical companies don't comment on it. They put forth a quiet period. Now, for a drug that nobody's ever heard of, maybe that works. For ecstasy, that's one of the most popular recreational drugs in the world, for people who are against making it legal, for people who have all these different reasons why they don't like what we're doing, there's a bunch of critics. And so to have critics and then not to respond because you're having a, quote, quiet period is one of the stupidest things that you could do. So we lost control of public narrative. We had critics. There was one example is just to say in March of 2023, there was an article in JAMA Psychiatry criticizing our therapeutic approach. we have a novel therapeutic approach. We customized it for MDMA for PTSD. We call it inner-directed therapy. We've been studying it for over 20 years. It's really got great outcomes and stuff. But here was this article in a scientific journal criticizing the method, and the pharmaceutical company decided not to respond at all. And in scientific debates, when you have a debate in scientific journals and somebody says something and you don't respond, they have the last word. That means you think they're right. You've got nothing more to say. So that was just one thing. So the pharmaceutical company didn't respond to concerns about the safety for subjects. We had one terrible incident of one therapist who developed a unethical sexual boundary violation with a patient after the MDMA sessions were over. And that was probably 8 years ago, something like that. It never happened before, hasn't happened since, but that became a big issue. And the pharma company didn't have any real good response. We had some researchers 2.5 years ago, more than 2.5 years ago now, offer to study the role of touch in MDMA assisted therapy. So I've talked about the hands. It's like therapists, but sometimes therapists will hold the patient's hand or put a arm, hand on their shoulder, or sometimes we'll hug them. Different kind of things. So this these research team for free wanted to study the role of touch in MDMA assisted therapy. And the company said, no, we will not provide you these videotapes. We don't want to know. It was unethical.
Why do you think they said no?
I think they said no because they just were not psychedelically oriented, and they were they didn't trust the therapist. They really were acting, in my sense, 100% unethically, this company, because if you're worried about something, you need to look at it. You have all these pharmaceutical companies said, oh, you ignored this side effect, and now that it's made public and there's millions of people using it and all these people are having this side effect. And pharmaceutical companies get criticized for that all the time. So here was this pharmaceutical company that I helped create that was refusing to let researchers study the role of touch. So I think to say no touch is not the right answer. To say all touch is okay is not the right answer. But where is the middle ground? You need to study it. So when the FDA advisory committee happened and there was all these allegations, oh, this one person was abused, one person is too many, that should have never happened. But the company didn't have anything to say, like, oh yeah, we've studied touch and this is what we've learned and this is how we're trying to make it safer. And they didn't do that. Then also what they didn't do is really explain how we arrived at the protocol design with inactive placebo that was clearly not going to work as a double blind. So there is a longer explanation to that. I'll just make it super fast and brief, which is my PhD, which I got in 2001, had a big, had a big chapter on how you do the double blind studies with psychedelics. My solution was, which I thought was right, later found out it was wrong, which is the beauty of doing research. You have an idea and you check it out. Does it work? Does it not? So my solution was therapy with low dose MDMA versus therapy with full dose MDMA. The challenge is find the low dose that's high enough so that you've done it, and you might confuse it with a full dose, but not so high that it's so therapeutic that then you can't tell a difference between the two groups because both groups are getting the benefits from MDMA. So over the course of 16 years, MAPS studied therapy with no MDMA, therapy with 25 milligrams, 30 milligrams, 40, 50, 75, 100, 125, and 150. We did this complete sort of dose response studies. And what we discovered, to my shock, was that the low doses, 25, 30, 40, 50, did confuse people enough, but they made people uncomfortable and they compromised the therapy. So keep in mind, these are PTSD patients. They're struggling with these traumas. You put them in a context where the trauma comes to the surface, but they have MDMA that activates them, but doesn't give enough fear reduction. So they feel uncomfortable. They still got better, but the people that had therapy with no MDMA did better than the people that had therapy with low dose MDMA. That was confusing to us. Then the other thing that we discovered that was surprising is we did one study with veterans, firefighters, and police officers. So, and one group got 30 milligrams, one got 75 milligrams, one got 125 milligrams. So I just want to say another thing is this idea of working with veterans, firefighters, police officers. We didn't think we'd get any police officers. We just wanted to say that this therapy is for those people who in some ways are spending their life trying to block this therapy and criminalize these drugs, but they have a terribly traumatizing drug. Police officers see the worst of humanity, and a lot of them are drunks and have problems with substance abuse, domestic violence. Their job is so hard, and they're told not to deal with it. Just do this stuff and just be tough. And so we said veterans, firefighters, and police officers more as a political signal that this is not just the hippies against the police. This is the hippies coming for the police to help them. All right. So in any case, we did get a police officer. We did get firefighters. Most were veterans. But what we discovered is that the 75 milligram dose group in this study did better than the 125. Now, only slightly better. And when you randomize things, this was only like 26 people in the study too. You randomize things, and it's not always equal, it's just random. So we had way more depression with PTSD in the 125 than in the 75. But in any case, the 75 milligram dose group did much better than we thought. And so the dose that was effective clinically was lower than we thought. So there was no sweet spot between this doses that make you uncomfortable, and then you flip over, and then you have a higher dose, and it makes you really make better progress because there's enough fear reduction. So that's what we did. We went to the FDA and said, we can give you blinding if you want, but you're going to make our job easier to see a difference between the two groups. And if you want us to give you blinding, we'd be glad to do it. But we recommend therapy with inactive placebo, because then our job is harder, because those people will do better than the people that got low dose MDMA, but also then the safety database is better, because everybody that takes therapy with inactive placebo, if there's a problem, it's because of therapy. It's not because, oh, you gave them a small amount of MDMA. So we had one woman try to kill herself twice in the first phase 3 study. We had another woman had such severe suicidal ideation that she checked herself into a hospital not to kill herself. Both were in the placebo group. And we know that that's working with severe PTSD. It's really difficult. So we had all these concerns and things that were raised by critics. They were not responded to. And then the FDA rejected it. So that was the heartbreak to see, because it didn't have to be. One of the criticisms that we had, and just briefly, is there's so many uninformed criticisms. One was 40% of the people in your study had done MDMA before, and therefore they're more likely to like MDMA, and they're more likely to have fewer side effects and get better results. Okay, now that is a valid question to raise. But as it turns out, the question was raised during the FDA advisory committee, but the data shows otherwise. The people that had no experience with MDMA had the same level of side effects, had the same level of benefits. But the more important point of this whole thing is that 40% had done MDMA and they still had PTSD. It's not in the drug, it's in the therapy. So anyway, so we had, I think, a bunch of criticisms that were mostly unfair, and a lot of doubt created about whether the data is reliable. And a former FDA official who just resigned in December, who is from the Division of Psychiatry, said that the results were too good to be true. They are that good, and it is true, but the results were better than anything people have seen before. So that also made people uncertain. And then it was a novel thing. It was drug with therapy, and it was really this new combination. So I think that's what caused a lot of this negativity. But I would blame the pharma company for not proactively explaining what we're doing, rather than being defensive and reactive.
But you've said that after, if there's decision, MAPS want to put more effort into public education. And you're
Yes.
doing a lot of work on that in Europe as well. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, because what people, the science was blocked for decades for psychedelic research. The culture is what permits or prohibits the science. So there was a conference on funders in psychedelics recently, and there was a Democratic member of the House of Representatives who'd run for Senate. He lost to J.D. Vance, who's now the vice president. But what he said is politics is downstream of culture. What that means is that culture is what determines what's going on in the politics. Similarly, with the public education about psychedelics, it's the culture. And if they're scared, then you get, oh, LSD causes chromosome damage and LSD makes you go crazy and MDMA causes brain damage and you can't do any research with this. So the public education, particularly in Europe and in the United States and elsewhere, is critical to get the permissions for the science. And we've lost control of the narrative because of this quiet periods and things. And now we need to regain it. So that's where I think the public education, the webinars, the seminars, and what I'm hoping that we'll do is return to a policy of transparency, meaning that what I believe we should do is publish all of our interactions with the FDA, all the data that we submit, all the data, all the questions we get back. That's what MAPS did for its entire history until a couple of years ago when the pharmaceutical company started becoming more like a traditional pharmaceutical company.
Thank you.
Yeah. And so for a psychedelic society organization like ours, what kind of strategy can we use for public education? What's the do's, what's the don'ts?
Yeah, okay, so now let me get into what I would call sort of a civil disobedience in a sense, or so let's look at one of the most amazing things, of course, that's being tried to roll back right now in the United States, but is gay rights. We have gay marriage. All right, so how did that come about? It took decades of people coming out, people that you would respect. You say, oh, this person is a great athlete, and they say, oh, I'm gay. Or this person is a great movie actor or actress or whatever. So what we need is people coming out about their psychedelic experiences. And so in Sweden, for psychedelic societies, it's not clear to me, and you could maybe tell me more, what is the risk of people saying, I did psychedelics, I did it in an illegal context, but I learned a lot, and now I feel healthier and stronger or whatever. I think, so that's a big part of what psychedelic societies can do. We've even had some events where at psychedelic societies where people just talk to each other and practice telling their drug stories. Like this happened to me and this is what I learned. And so I think that that's a really big thing. The other is to really engage with the scientists and the key opinion leaders and share with them the research and then see what kind of criticisms they might have or what kind of questions they might have. So you need this groundswell of sort of people changing culture by talking about their own experiences. And you need the key opinion leaders talking about what their questions are. The other part is, and I don't know how much, but you should be able to get this data. How much does your national healthcare spend on mental illness?
Yep.
How many people commit suicide? How many people are depressed? How many people go into mental institutions? What is the cost? And what do the current providers think about the tools that they currently have available, about the new therapies or the electroconvulsive therapy or the new medications or the old medications? Is there a perceived need for new treatments? Is there an unmet medical need? That I think is part of it. And then the other part is this whole edifice of prohibition, which I know is still pretty strong in Sweden, is you need to really, I think, have a lot more conversations, and psychedelic societies can, I think, really catalyze these conversations that the drug war is counterproductive. It's not about stopping drug abuse. The drug war has always been about persecuting minorities. It's about using the weapons of the police state to go after people who, for one reason or another, are marginalized. One of the things in Florida, I'll just say, and again, I don't know that this applies to Sweden, but in Florida, where we have a very right-wing governor, when they arrest people for anything and they get a felony, then they cannot vote. So the drug laws were used to go after hundreds of thousands of poor African Americans and others who tend to vote Democratic, and to make it so they could not vote because you go after them and you get a felony. It's called felony disenfranchisement.
Oh.
So I think this idea of fundamentally raising questions about the drug war itself, and then also about unmet medical need and speaking out in public, key opinion leaders. And I think one of the ways to really consider doing this is to start a small study to see if the Psychedelic Society of Sweden could raise enough funds to actually pay for whatever you think is the most important study. Because that's the final thing, is you get new scientific data from your own country, and that's what changes people's minds the most. Because we also have, and I believe it's true in Sweden, is this idea of earned media, which means that if you do something and it's covered by the news, by the newspapers, by the TV, then you don't have to pay for that. That's earned media, and science and new scientific studies generate earned media. You get in the media, you get to talk about stuff. So I would say to think about, is there one particular study that would be sympathetic patients that could be done in a small pilot study in Sweden that you think would have a big impact on popular consciousness as it relates to psychedelics? I don't know what that might be. In the US, it was veterans, because veterans are held on a pedestal, and also they have terrible PTSD from our self-destructive wars in Iraq, Vietnam, all of this. So I think you could do sort of a strategic analysis of which small study, which patient population would be really open people's minds. Maybe I see this 1,200 per year death by suicide in Sweden. Maybe you work with people that tried to kill themselves but didn't,
Yeah.
and then you do therapy with them or something. So I think that's all what I would recommend to the Psychedelic Society.
Well, thank you, thank
Yeah.
you. And another thing that can help, I guess, is what's going on in Europe as well. And you mentioned in the beginning a few very interesting projects happening right now in Europe. You would like to share about that?
Yeah, well, some of these are just beginning, so they're not actually. So the one that well, one of the things that Lycos did that I thought was really terrible was shut down all of the research in Europe. So MAPS purposely, to make things international with the FDA, when you do phase 3 studies, they want most of the data to come from the United States, but you can also gather data from other countries. So our phase 3 studies were conducted mostly in the US, but also in Israel and in Canada. And so we're giving the FDA regulators comfort. Here, look, Health Canada is saying yes. The Ministry of Health in Israel is saying yes. We're all doing this together. And then after that was moving on for a couple of years, we started research in the Netherlands, in Germany. We're trying to do stuff in Norway, and in England, we've done stuff. And this was moving forward with the European Medicines Agency, and they had agreed that all we needed to do was one more phase 3 study in Europe, building on the 2 phase 3 studies in the United States and Israel and Canada. So we started doing that. And then in January of 2023, Lycos said, oh, we've got financial problems, but mostly all that really matters is the FDA. We're going to shut down all the research in Europe after really, really good results. So what the Dutch government did, and this could be a model for Sweden, is that they ended up, the person that, Eric Vermetten, who was one of the people working on the research in the Netherlands, was the chief psychiatrist for the Dutch Ministry of Defense. And he's a world expert in PTSD. And he saw people getting better from MDMA-assisted therapy than he'd seen in any other way. This research was doing great. Then Lykos shuts it down. So then what the Dutch government does is says, we need to have a committee, a Dutch state committee on MDMA, and we need to review all of the literature. We need to look at the unmet medical need in the Netherlands. They spent a year doing a study, looking at all the same data that the FDA advisory committee did. They had real subject matter experts instead of people that knew nothing about it. And they had to publish a paper, basically a book, justifying their conclusions. So the FDA advisory committee came out on June 4th of 2024. Negative, we recommend against it. Unfortunately, from the timing point of view, but 2 days later, June 6, 2024, the Dutch State Committee on MDMA came out with its report, complete opposite of the FDA advisory. They believed therapy was demonstrated efficacy, demonstrated safety, major unmet medical need, and they suggested what they called naturalist studies, like compassionate use. So that's something to explore in Sweden too, is whether you can get some sort of compassionate use. So now we're trying to restart the studies in Europe, and the studies that for the compassionate use, I mentioned we've done trainings in Iceland now several times. There's a psychedelic conference in Iceland. I don't know if anybody from Sweden is coming to it, but it's coming up at the end of February. So I'll be in Iceland with a bunch of MAPS people and other people as well. And we had people there that were from Denmark. And so this group Oasis, and they do work with refugees. This is just a total byline, the side effect, but well, sideline. I just want to add that we have 3 kids. My 26-year-old daughter is the most political of our kids. She works in Washington, D.C. on helping refugees and migrants. And she's just lost her job because they were funded by a government grant, and Trump is shutting down all the humanitarian projects. Just to say how terrible that is. So this group Oasis in Denmark works with refugees and migrants. In Denmark, in the early stages of the Syrian refugees, they made them into citizens so that they are now also available to be treated under national health care. And so this is one of the projects that we're working towards, would be MDMA in Denmark for refugees who speak Danish, who are the second generation, not as religious as their parents. And that's still in the process. What they're looking for is a principal investigator from a major university. So that still has to happen. In the United States, it's easier to do research without being connected to an institution. But in Europe, most of the research, you need to be connected to an institution, which is conservative. Institutions are, if we had to be connected to an institution in the United States, we would not have started MDMA research because no institution was willing to do it. So anyway, that's one project. Now, we've also had 2 trainings in Sarajevo. And we've had people from 22 countries at the last training in Sarajevo. One of them, I'll just add, was so inspired. We had 14 people from Arabic countries. We do a lot of work in Israel, but we're also trying to do work throughout the Arab regions. And one of the people that was there was so inspired, moved back to the West Bank. And now we have a project at a hospital in East Jerusalem that they want to do MDMA research. Incredible. From this training in Sarajevo. Now, the people in Sarajevo, though, want to do a study with, these are women survivors of the Srebrenica massacre, where about 8,600 Muslim men and boys were murdered, and the women were survived. And they've got a terrible trauma after 30 years still. So this will be a study there. The studies that were done in the Netherlands were done, and also in Germany, were done with PTSD from any cause. That is one of the things that we learned in 16 years of phase 2 studies, is that if you have PTSD from war, from sexual abuse, from natural disasters, from car accidents, from grief, whatever it happens to be, once you're obsessing about something and you can never go past it, and you're highly traumatized and you're easily triggered and you're hypervigilant and you're emotionally numb and you're all of this, it doesn't matter the cause. The therapy is the same regardless of the cause of PTSD. And so these earlier studies in Europe, in England, they're just in veterans. In the Netherlands, they were with PTSD from any cause. In Germany, also PTSD from any cause. So I think that Europe doesn't have the same culture of philanthropy that we have in the United States. So there tends to be studies that are and projects only funded by government or major foundations. In the U.S., most of our stuff has been funded by individuals who act beside that. But I think that the work with psilocybin is also quite prominent in Europe, and research with 5-MeO-DMT is happening, and a bunch of stuff happened. Also, we did work in Prague in the Czech Republic. Yeah, there's a lot of really promising steps forward in Europe, but I would say approval in Europe is for MDMA is several years behind the FDA.
Yeah, and talking about the work in Europe, I know that you know about Psychedelic Care initiative, the first EU citizen initiative that is collecting 1 million signatures to call upon the European Commission to implement, regulate, and make accessible safe psychedelic therapy. In the bigger picture, what role does an initiative like that have, and why is it important that we participate in this?
Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up. As far as educating the public and changing cultural minds, have things discussed at the European Parliament. Having things discussed through as a European new policy initiative gives you this earned media that's free media, but it also is an expression of 1 million signatures. If you can get 1 million people saying they want it. And I think what will eventually be the case, because of national health care in most of the countries in Europe, is once MDMA or psilocybin is approved, you're going to have a better ability to have it actually distributed and administered to the people who need it. Whereas in the United States, we have around a quarter of the people don't even have insurance. So and a lot of people are underinsured. So I think these citizen initiatives, things bubble up from the top, from the bottom. I mean, the politicians are often stuck in certain things. How did we get marijuana? Like in my state, Massachusetts, I can go within a few miles of my house, and there's multiple marijuana dispensaries where I can go just buy marijuana, which I do. And I don't need to be a patient. I can be, now how did that begin? It began with citizen initiatives like the 1 million signatures. There are multiple states in America where instead of just waiting for politicians to do something, if you spend enough money and get enough signatures, you can get a topic on the ballot, and then the citizens vote for it. And then the government of the different states has to do it because the citizens voted for it. It's the same as if the legislature voted for it. And so medical marijuana began with citizen initiatives. And then after a while, people were educated enough that what they'd been told about marijuana wasn't entirely true or was mostly false. All right. And so then you start on marijuana legalization for anybody to get it. And now there's $36 billion sales, roughly, they're predicting, in marijuana in the United States. And a lot of that goes to taxes to the government. So the drug policy reform that we've seen in America has begun precisely with these citizen initiatives like the million person signatures that you're trying to get in Europe. So I think it's critically important that you all are working on it and that work, because it's shocking to me to go from a place where in many states, California, Illinois, Colorado, in Massachusetts, where marijuana is legal, and to go to other countries in Europe where you have to hide if you're using it. And it's just, the penalties are worse than the drug too. So
Yeah.
I think that these citizen initiatives are sometimes the only way to really catalyze, sort of policies that are frozen and that the traditional elected officials are not going to work to change until they're bubbled up from the below, that they should work on it.
Right. Okay. So we're actually just going to put up the QR code for Psychedelic Care so that you all participants here can scan it and save it
That's hilarious. I didn't know you could do QR codes with mushrooms in the middle of them.
Beautiful. Yeah. So yes.
Wow, that was great. Yeah, I think it's fundamentally important, and if you do that, now there are a bunch of psychedelic pharma companies that are trying to do research in Europe, so there's a fair amount of that already. But this is more about personal growth and for a range of other things. So I think it's really, really important.
Yeah,
Great.
we agree. And as we move towards the end for this conversation, before our Q&A, I know we have a lot of questions, so I really want to make time for that. But if you could give one piece of advice to the Swedish Psychedelic Society or other psychedelic societies around Europe to create meaningful impact, what would that be?
I think the most meaningful impact, because of the amount of misinformation that there is research.
Mm.
So that's where this two-part thing. One is telling your stories. That's really important. And the other, which in America, I think it's been even more critical, the research part, because that's how you try to get the key opinion leaders, the major, psychiatrists. It's to really facilitate research in Sweden with psychedelics. And maybe it's in partnership that you talk to one of these psychedelic pharmaceutical companies, or you think about what would be, again, your most ideal study, and then you see it. Now, it doesn't cost that much money. You can do what are called treatment development studies. Open label means no control group, for 12 people or 15 people. And you might say, so one of the things that's so interesting is MDMA for postpartum depression.
Mm.
That can be really the oxytocin release from MDMA, the bonding. MDMA for eating disorders, I think, is one of the better uses of MDMA, because it's about self-acceptance. And a lot of people with eating disorders are very much, struggling for control, and they can control what they eat, but that's about it. So I think that I would encourage you to try to think about a small pilot study that doesn't cost that much money. Maybe you can find either government grants or individuals to support it. And then, again, just this coming out that people, tend to think if you're a drug user, you're a burnout dropout, or whatever. I don't know what your parents think when you first start talking to them about drugs. Or maybe they educated you from an early age about them. But I think
No, I think they saw the change and okay, wow, it really helped.
wow, see, that's incredible, because there's so many people that have that change but don't speak out about it.
Mm.
So people don't know.
Right. Yeah. All right. It's somehow sad to say that it goes towards the end for this conversation, but it continues, and I think we should invite questions. What do you think about that?
Oh, the harder the better. Don't hold back.
Right.
Totally fine.
All right. So let's see, we have some people here. Who would like to go for the question? Yes, come up here.
Hey, yes. Hi there. So a lot of the MAPS work has been done around PTSD.
Yeah.
And I'm curious about complex PTSD. Have you been looking into that, the childhood trauma?
Well, first off, yes, we most of the people in our studies have complex PTSD.
Okay.
Now, there's a researcher, Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote the book, The Body Keeps the Score. He was a Dutch psychiatrist. Briefly, I'll mention that in 1961, the very first use of a psychedelic to treat PTSD took place in the Netherlands, Dr. Bastiaans, and it was LSD for people that were in the concentration camps. So he called it LSD for concentration camp syndrome. And Bessel studied with Dr. Bastiaans. So Bessel van der Kolk worked with us on phase 3. He did not work with us on phase 2. And what he said was, don't work with complex PTSD in phase 3. He said that complex PTSD, for people that don't have a strong attachment, that had childhood traumas, they're the hardest people to work with. And if you really want to get good results and end up moving forward, don't work with complex PTSD. And so what we said was that we have worked with complex PTSD. Most of the people that are in our studies have complex PTSD. Even the people in the military, most of the people who have PTSD that we've seen from military-related PTSD also had earlier childhood trauma.
Yeah.
It makes them more vulnerable to later traumas turning into PTSD. So what Bessel said is, okay, if you're going to work with people with complex PTSD, I want you to add these measures of attachment, of what's called alexithymia, where you're not in touch with your emotions, various measures, which we did. And then, to Bessel's surprise, those people that had complex PTSD that had difficult attachment, on average, did better than the rest of the people in our studies.
Wow.
That they're so hungry for this sense of connection, this sense of bringing their parts together, that they're so in need of this healing that goes to these deep levels, that once they get some of it, they just respond really, really well. So, you know, most of the women in the studies that have had sexual abuse have had it from childhood. Not all of them, some just adult attacks, but from childhood. And as I said, many of the veterans. So this paper by Bessel van der Kolk was in PLOS ONE. I would encourage people to try to read that, because it really demonstrates how MDMA-assisted therapy is really, really good for complex PTSD.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and let me add one other thing, which is that one of the problems with prolonged exposure, which is one of the main treatments for PTSD, is that you have to pick what they call an index trauma. You pick your worst trauma, and that's all you focus on during the therapy. But what we've seen in the research, and we call it the archaeology of PTSD, is people have layers and layers and layers of trauma, many times going back to childhood. And that when you're stuck just dealing with this supposed one worst trauma, you don't get all the healing that you can get by talking about your other traumas, because they keep focusing you on that. Now, also the problem is that we've had some people in America who wanted to be in our studies who had racial trauma, African Americans who were prejudiced against a lot of places, and they couldn't say, here's our one index trauma. And the measure that we use is only about this one index trauma, and that's the measure FDA wants, EMA wants, called the CAPS. So that sometimes people with complex PTSD who can't pinpoint the worst thing that ever happened to them, but they just had repeated traumas over a period of time, are even excluded from being in the studies because of the measures that we use. It's completely perverse. Yeah, it's just so. But I guess the good news is, again, that we do work with people with complex PTSD, and it works very, very well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Next question.
Hello, nice to listen to you and see you. This is maybe a little bit spiritual question, but what do you think that it is that you get connected with that makes you feel so completely safe and loved in an MDMA session?
Wow. Well, that's a fantastic question. That's a fantastic question. What I think you get connected with too is yourself. So if I had to summarize, what does MDMA do? I would say self-acceptance. So in addition to releasing serotonin and dopamine, norepinephrine, this oxytocin, this hormone of nursing mothers, of love, connection, that people end up feeling safe because they're amygdala, where we process fear, has reduced activity because of MDMA. But it's this ability to just sit with yourself and feel comfortable and safe so that these traumatic memories are not overwhelming, or that you don't feel like you have to defend against them because they're so, you'll just open up to them, you'll sink into this depression, you'll never get out of it. That's the fear a lot of times. But this sense of connecting to yourself as healthy and whole. Now, there's
Like the higher self.
Yeah. Now, I was about to say, there's a therapy called internal family systems, and they talk about this higher self, the self with a capital S. It's this kind of sort of the unified parts connected with the universe, and that we're often disconnected from that. And so this idea that MDMA or even internal family systems, different therapies shift you into being part, not this isolated individual that's bound by death and birth and that is, here and gone, but more part of this eternal story, this big picture of life self, the higher self, that you can be connected to that. I think that's more likely that happens with LSD or psilocybin, that sort of reduces your sense of ego identification, this default mode network that neuroscientists talk about, and then you move beyond these ego-oriented states of consciousness. MDMA does, in a way, the opposite, is you sink so deep into yourself that you can absorb the universe without it being overwhelming, rather than dissolving yourself to move into it. So I think it's the self-love and self-acceptance and this higher self that you're connected with on a spiritual level.
Yeah, that's my experience. So thank you.
Oh, good. Are you a therapist or?
No, I'm just practicing. Yeah, I go to therapy. Yeah.
Okay. And have you, and I guess I don't want to put you on the spot, but have you found, MDMA to be useful or?
Yes, absolutely. For me, it's like I want to break this patterns, the insecurity, to be more safe, breaking patterns, and So
Okay.
yeah,
And so
I feel that it helps a lot.
okay.
Absolutely.
And you feel it connects you to your deeper spiritual higher self, or?
Absolutely. I feel that I carry myself in so much love that I never felt so much love for myself in any other circumstances. So it's very beautiful.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a beautiful experience. It's a super key for me to change, It's the main key.
Yeah. Well, I think that once you have that sense of self-love and self-acceptance, then you can look at things in a much more calmer way, and a more confident way, and less defensive, less judgmental. Yeah, I think that's why MDMA is one of the most widely used drugs all over the world.
Mm.
And it should both be medicalized, legalized, and made into MDMA churches. So we're seeing that in America too.
You're seeing that, and you're doing a great job. So thank you so much, and thank you for the answer.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah. Hi.
Hi.
So all of the research is done on patients that are highly traumatized, who've gone through a lot. What's your take on the use of psychedelics, and even, I don't know if research would be relevant on healthy patients and that path to ultimately, I guess, it's spiritual growth and personal growth?
I thank you for that question. I think that's why we need drug legalization, not just medicalization. But one of the things that is being talked about a lot these days is preventative medicine. It's not just that you wait till somebody is sick and you treat them. It's like, how do you prevent disease in the first place? So I think that using MDMA on, quote, healthy people, who we all have our own inner struggles still, before some of them turn into major mental depression or PTSD or eating disorders or anything, that's where we need to go more and more is. And I think that when we talk about in the future, those people that are going to be influenced positively by psychedelics, most of them will be healthy people who take it outside of medical contexts for spiritual connection, personal growth. I think that it's absolutely essential, and it leads to this idea that we need broader drug policy reform than just medicalization. And I think you can even talk about it really in terms of quantifying healthcare savings. You know, like for example, Crohn's disorder, irritable bowel syndrome. There's a bunch of physical illnesses that have a psychosomatic aspect to them. And when you deal with the traumas and the things that produce these sort of psychosomatic illnesses, that these illnesses can go away as well. So that's just after they've appeared. But if you can do the work early on. So here I'll say something really, really controversial, which is that I believe that the FDA has said that if they approve MDMA for PTSD, which they eventually will, it will be for 18 years or older. But if they do that approval, then we must do studies. We're required to do studies with traumatized adolescents. And not just like 16 and 17-year-olds, but go down to 13 and 12-year-olds and even lower. There's a lot of people that are traumatized at a younger age. And waiting for them to be older after it's, go through all of your teenage years while you're traumatized is not so healthy, and it gets worse and worse. So I think not just preventative medicine for adults, for personal growth and things like that, but we really need to do work down the age for younger and younger kids. And I believe that my bar mitzvah when I was 13 was one of the big letdowns of my life, because I thought something spiritual was going to happen. I believed it, and nothing ever happened. I was just like, okay, nice party, thank you. I'm the same. God didn't come. Nothing happened to me. And I felt this deep emptiness. So I just realized a lot that kids, when they're 12 and 13 and going through these rites of passage, that would be a good time also for psychedelic experiences for those parents and kids that are sympathetic with that. Not for everybody. So I think we'll see more and more this concept of psychedelics as preventative medicine. But I will add one last thing, which is that what we see is that legalization follows medicalization. That once you medicalize, then people start questioning everything, and you start doing more wondering why are things illegal for personal growth or for preventative medicine. So over time, I think we're going to end up with more and more of the psychedelic use by people who are relatively healthy for spirituality, vision quests. What are you going to do with your life? A lot of people use psychedelics for vision quests to help them clarify what their goals are. So I think more and more of that, and we see a lot of this in terms of microdosing psychedelics in Silicon Valley and others. Those are people that are trying to do deeper performance, better performance. They don't perceive of themselves necessarily as mentally ill, but they want to do more. So I think that, that's the direction we need to go in. But that does get to this whole question about drug policy reform and getting past prohibition.
And change of culture.
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much. All right. We'll take one, if we have time to, but at least one question from the chat as well.
Right. So this question is from Philip Bromberg, and he wrote, "Hi Rick, thanks for being with us. There seems to be a lot of support for psychedelics in the new Trump administration and among its allies. Why do you think that is, and what does it mean for the possible approval of psychedelic therapies?"
Well, first off, it means that doing psychedelics is not going to turn everybody into a hippie. I wish that it would have. I think it's true. So, this idea that Antonio Gracias is, a supporter of Trump, but he's also a philanthropist and supporter of psychedelics. I think that there's been RFK Jr., who's been talked about as the Secretary of HHS, is also very pro-psychedelics. I think it's because we've had a strategy from the very beginning to achieve bipartisan support for psychedelics. And one of the things that we've done is taken psychedelics. It's one of the few things in America that's not part of the culture wars right now. It may become so, but it's not. And we do have bipartisan support. And so I think there's a lot of people in the Trump administration who just question the status quo, question how the world is right now, and want innovation and change. And so but I would say it's primarily because of the work with veterans that we have the support for psychedelics within the Trump administration, but not only. That's one of the things. The other is just a lot of the people who came from tech have had their own psychedelic experiences. It hasn't transformed them all in the ways that we would have hoped, but I think we're in a situation. I think the way I address it is this idea that we need to build common ground. I had a meeting with one of the U.S. Supreme Court justices informally, and I had a chance to ask him an ethical question. And I said, I've accepted $1 million donation from this woman, Rebecca Mercer. Her father and she owned Cambridge Analytica, which was the company that scraped all the data from Facebook. And I said, I've got all this money from her. Her only limitation was that the $1 million go to help veterans. And so I said, ethically, what do you think I should have done? You know, people are criticizing me for taking this donation. And he said, the essence of democracy is finding common ground with people with whom you may disagree with on everything else, but you search for this common ground and you build on it. And I think that that's right. And he said, in this hyper-partisan era, there's not that much of it. There's not enough of people trying to build this common ground. And so I think to the extent that the Trump administration is open to psychedelics, it's important for us to work with them on those areas. And then once you've established some common ground, then, and I found this has happened a couple times with me, is then you can raise other questions about areas that you may disagree with. But people will not listen to you without this feeling that you've got some common ground. So I think we work with the Trump administration as much as we can on psychedelics, and then we end up trying to broaden the conversations so that we're not just hiding all these other areas of disagreement. But it's a unusual situation now that we're in with the Trump administration, and I think it'll be good for psychedelics. I don't think it's worth it. I think all the trade-offs overall are worse. But since there are potential advantages to outreach with them, we should use them.
Thank you.
All right. So time to close down. Unfortunately, but we really want to thank you, Rick, for your 40+ years of dedicated work, for keep breaking ground, for staying true to your mission. It inspires people to dare do the same. And we are so honored and so pleased to have had you with us tonight. And
we would love to have you again.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'd be very happy to strategize with you all about if you wanted to think about what kind of a study you might want to try to start or something like that. I think that is the high point of leverage.
Would love to. Your help will be so helpful.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
Okay.
please.
Terrific.
Thank you.
Terrific. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. And to all our participants, thank you so much for being with us tonight. Yes.
Thank you. Okay, bye for now.